So generally, governments have been pretty keen to encourage economic growth, to create economic growth. And it's just worth looking, kind of a little bit at why that is. And essentially, economic growth, whilst it doesn't automatically lead to improvements in quality of life, it's pretty clear that quality of life today is a lot higher than it was 1,000 years ago. And so economic growth must have had something to do with that. So what sort of difference does sustained growth make? And we can look at it. We can say, firstly, it's clearly going to make a difference to government finances. So it's obviously the case that an increase in GDP is going to lead to an increase in the tax base. The government's going to get more income tax, more indirect taxes like VAT, more corporation tax, and it's quite likely that there'll be that growth often, but not necessarily, creates jobs. Reducing unemployment and therefore reducing government expenditure on unemployment benefit. So, why does that matter? If the government has more money, then obviously it can then put that expenditure into public goods, into merit goods, into infrastructure, all of which is useful for us. Infrastructure, not just in the sense that it creates more growth, but infrastructure in the form of public parks, in the form of just roads that you drive on. So as a result of economic growth, governments have been able to do far more than they could 100, 150 years ago. Universal education, universal healthcare, and so on and so forth. That all comes from money. So what we're trying to do is to tie it back into living standards. So secondly, we can then look at, well, what does it mean for kind of subgroups within the economy? So if we take kind of firms, we know that growth leads to profit. And we know that profit can be used by firms. It can be reinvested. And that can lead to dynamic efficiency. And that has an impact on other groups within the economy as well. We know that dynamic efficiency leads to improvements in process, which leads to decrease in the price level overall. It leads to improvements in products. So again, kind of higher quality of life. If you look at the first car that I ever bought, I bought a Fiat Uno new in about 1990. It cost about the same in real terms, as or more indeed in real terms than an equivalent entry level car today. But it didn't have any airbags. It didn't have anything really. It had a steering wheel. And so economic growth, going into profits, that's led to better products, cheaper products, and some of it's an accumulation of research, an accumulation of ideas over time. Part of the reason that we're able to create vaccines for COVID-19 so quickly was that we were building on years and years of previous successful research, and therefore that has an impact on households and workers. So if we take workers as a third group. Then as a worker, your life has changed beyond recognition over the last 200 years. Improvements in productivity, output per worker, which is where most growth tends to come from. Improvements in productivity, they tend to mean that there's been a decrease in the length of the working week. 150 years ago, you're probably working a 60-hour week. Today, 35, 40, something like that. The nature of work has changed. So you're not having your arms ripped off in an unsafe factory. You have paid holidays, and all of this has come about from growth because governments can afford to pass the legislation that forces firms to fit working, safety equipment, that forces firms to give you paid holidays and so on and so forth. So as an employee, the range of work, the safety of work, the enjoyment of work, the amount of work that you actually have to do to earn a certain amount of money, all of this has been improved by improvements in productivity that have created economic growth. And finally, if you look at households, for you and me, life is completely different than it was 100, 150 years ago. Improvements in technology, things like birth control or mobile phones or the internet, all of those are fundamentally changing the way in which you live your lives. Your quality of life is higher as a result. And technology has also led to labour-saving devices. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, all those sorts of things. Which mean that you've got far greater amounts of leisure time as an individual. Economic growth has led to significant improvements in the housing stock. Those of you who I taught will know all about shared toilets even 60 or 70 years ago. So fundamentally, living standards have risen very significantly over the last 150, 200 years, and that's correlated with a big increase in GNI or GDP per capita. And clearly there are links between the two, but it doesn't necessarily mean that further growth is necessarily going to lead to further improvements in living standards, and it doesn't mean that growth in and of itself necessarily will make people better off in living standards terms. So if we look at the costs or the limitations of economic growth, then we say, well, look, a hell of a lot of this depends. So firstly, we can say, well, a lot depends on the nature of growth. So what is it that's growing? So here you could just bring out kind of actual versus potential growth. So what we know is that if actual is greater than potential, if aggregate demand is growing faster than aggregate supply, then that's going to create inflation. There have been periods where potential has grown faster than actual. During industrial revolution, where productivity is increasing so fast that actually what it leads to is big output gaps and unemployment goes up. And so what we want is kind of balanced growth. But also, what is the growth? So there's this idea of economic bads. So remember that GDP just counts what's made, just how much it sells for. So I don't know. So dealing with toxic nuclear waste, that costs money. That's part of GDP. Making paintings and selling them, that costs money. That's GDP. But obviously, one has a very different impact on living standards. A much more favourable impact on living standards than the other one does. So whether the type of growth or the composition of growth, they're both going to be quite important. Secondly, there's this. We know that obviously, growth may not be sustainable. So therefore, there's kind of environmental and kind of resource depletion issues. Resource depletion is that idea that actually we've hit peak oil. We've got finite resources on the planet. And that therefore we simply can't keep on, we can't sustain these living standards, even perhaps at their current level, some would suggest. Or, there are large numbers of external costs that are associated with economic growth, especially during a period of industrialization, where manufacturing is growing. And we all know about climate change and all those sorts of stuff. There's a suggestion. There's a guy called Kuznets who he came up with this curve for something else that I'll tell you about in a minute. But the environmental Kuznets curve suggests that it depends, therefore, on your level of GDP per capita. That suppose that's emissions up on the vertical axis, and that's GDP per capita. The suggestion is that initially things will get worse, but eventually governments will have the money, to be able to impose restrictions. And there have been signs that in places like the EU, kind of emissions per capita have been falling, reasonably quickly over the last 20 or 30 years. Perhaps less so, if you were to look at the States. So it may depend. But maybe we're not necessarily doomed. So maybe once growth reaches a certain point, governments can afford to put in things like emissions controls. And the same, Kuznets' original argument was linked to inequality. It's kind of inevitably the case, that as soon as growth occurs, inequality is going to increase. Because, obviously, the benefits of growth, the fruits of growth, goes to the people who start up businesses and the people who work there. So if you look at, rapidly industrializing economies, what tends to happen is that workers in urban areas, the capital city, the seaboard, people on the coast, they tend to benefit a lot, because that's where the businesses go. People living in rural areas, they tend not to benefit. And we know from elsewhere in the course that rising inequality, yes, fundamentally means that actually living standards may not be really increasing at all for the majority of people. Kuznets said, well, look, that might be true at the early stages of growth. So let's suppose that's some sort of inequality measure, and that's GDP per capita. He said, yeah, sure, as income rises, inequality gets worse. That's kind of bound to be the case. But beyond a certain point, we can have a welfare state. The government can come in and provide universal education and healthcare, and maybe, therefore, again, inequality will start to fall, but not if you're in the US. And then just a couple of other points. The pressure for growth comes with an opportunity cost. In order to grow, we generally need more capital. So if you look at kind of China in its early stages of growth, what they were doing was they were producing a hell of a lot of capital goods, but not that many consumer goods. So to promote growth, you might say we're going to invest more. Fine, produce more capital goods. But what that means is you have fewer consumer goods for your existing workforce population. So whether growth is beneficial or not, it fundamentally probably depends on the role of the state. So if you've got good government that can redistribute the benefits of growth, if you can control the negative externalities and avoid destroying the planet, then further growth may well be worth having. Although much is likely to depend on your initial stage of development. So obviously, if your GDP per capita is $1,000, then growth it's a no-brainer. You've got to increase income because you're living in abject poverty. If GDP per capita is already $20,000, most research suggests that that the case is much more mixed at this stage, and that there's a very, very weak correlation between improvements in life outcomes, quality of life, after $20,000 per person. Other things are far more important in determining quality of life than whether you've got $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 per capita. It's other things about society.